Ever feel like you're trying to decipher a secret language, or the alphabet, or the next, there's a tariff here, a rate cut there, and suddenly your grocery bill looks like some kind of cryptic puzzle? Well, you've just tuned into your decoder ring. Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we spit through all that ore, translate the jargon, and pull out the really crucial insights from today's information flood. Think of it as going from bewildered to brilliantly informed, without spending hours wading through the source material yourself.
Exactly. And today we're plunging headfirst into, a really fascinating collection of recent developments. They've been handily brought together by the Consumers.App podcast. This is in their May 2025 snapshot of consumer news. We're navigating pretty much everything, from the shifting global trade landscape and the intriguing world of central bank maneuvers, all the way to the ongoing battle against plastic pollution and, the ever-evolving science of food and health. Get ready to connect some maybe seemingly unrelated dots and arm yourself with knowledge that really matters.
All right, let's kick things off on the international stage then. Reuters brings us this headline. Facing tariffs and uncertainty, Canadian firms look past U.S. markets. Now, for decades, the U.S. has been Canada's #1 trading partner. I mean, something like over 3/4 of their exports head south, right? But it sounds like that picture might be changing. What's the core of this shift?
Well, what's really interesting here is the direct consequence of proposed U.S. tariffs. For Canadian manufacturers, especially in sectors like steel, a potential 25% duty acts like an immediate price surge. It's huge. So this means higher costs for their raw materials, and that inevitably leads to increased prices for consumers and the worrying prospect of job losses too.
Job losses.
Yeah. And we're also seeing this ripple effect in the pharmaceutical industry. You've got companies like PNP Pharmaceuticals actively seeking partnerships in Asia. It's basically a way to navigate this tariff uncertainty and, try to stabilize their supply chains. So this shift isn't just an economic strategy. It's potentially a pretty significant recalibration of Canada's global allegiances in a changing geopolitical landscape.
So this isn't just about a few industries feeling the pinch, is it? I mean, the U.S. and Canada, they have this massive trading relationship.
Oh, absolutely massive. In 2023, the total value of goods traded between the two, a staggering U.S. $713 billion, which is nearly 20% of Canada's entire GDP. That's the total value of everything the country produces. So any significant disruption like these proposed tariffs could have, pretty serious repercussions, especially for the manufacturing sector, which employs over 1.8 million Canadians. Sectors like vehicles, auto parts, energy, and, as we just mentioned, pharmaceuticals are particularly vulnerable.
But Canadian companies aren't just standing by, it seems. The headline says they're looking beyond the U.S. What strategies are they actually employing?
Precisely. The main approach we're seeing is this drive to diversify their export markets. And there's a really strong emphasis on Asia. Pharmaceutical companies, for instance, are actively forging new relationships, strengthening existing ones with partners in places like India. Research suggests this is, it's a smart move. It indicates that while it's initially resource-intensive, cost for market entry, building new networks, diversifying trade ultimately makes a company less vulnerable.
Less vulnerable to political risks and relying too much on just one partner.
Exactly. Less vulnerable to political risks and that market volatility you get when you're heavily reliant on a single trading partner.
Now, tariffs, they're essentially taxes on imports, right? So how does that impact us, the consumers up in Canada?
Exactly right. Tariffs increase the cost of goods coming into Canada, which inevitably translates to higher prices for Canadian shoppers. And this is particularly concerning in sectors like steel and pharmaceuticals, where there might not be many readily available alternative suppliers. We also need to consider the potential for supply chain disruptions as companies scramble, to find new sources and markets that can further contribute to price increases and logistical challenges.
It's no wonder economists tend to, frown upon tariffs.
Yeah, that's a key insight. The broad economic consensus is that tariffs tend to hinder overall economic growth and well-being. While the intention might be, say, to protect domestic industries, the reality often involves higher prices for consumers and reduced competitiveness for exporters who might face retaliatory measures from other countries. You often see downgraded predictions for economic growth, increased worries about potential recessions when tariffs get imposed.
And we're already seeing a tangible response, you mentioned, in the pharmaceutical sector.
Yes, the data shows a clear increase in Canadian pharmaceutical exports, things like capsules and tablets, specifically heading to Asian markets like India. This isn't just a coincidence. It's a direct consequence of those U.S. tariffs. It signals a significant shift in supply chains and, the potential for new revenue streams for these Canadian companies, which it raises an important question for you, the listener. How might these global trade shifts eventually affect what you pay for everyday goods, including maybe your medications?
Definitely something to consider. Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about something else that affects our wallets. Interest rates. Reuters has this headline: Swiss National Bank ready to take rates below zero to tackle low inflation. Below zero? That sounds a bit strange.
It does sound strange, yeah. But what's really interesting here is the Swiss National Bank's proactive stance against, persistently low inflation. They've only taking it down to just 0.25%. And they're even signaling they're prepared to go further, potentially into negative territory.
Okay, let's unpack this. Negative interest rates. How does that actually work in practice? What does that mean?
Essentially, negative interest rates mean that commercial banks are actually charged for holding excess reserves at the central bank. The idea is to encourage them to lend more money out, hoping to stimulate investment and economic activity. Switzerland actually experimented with negative rates back in the mid-2010s.
Oh, they did?
Yeah. The goal then, much like now, was to prevent the Swiss franc from becoming too strong, which could hurt their export-heavy economy, and to gently push inflation upwards. But, it's a delicate balancing act. It can put pressure on bank profits and influence how people choose to save their money. Think of it like this. A bank might have a certain amount of money in a special account that isn't charged the negative interest. That encourages them to still hold some reserves safely,
So the Swiss National Bank has a specific target for inflation they're aiming for.
Exactly. Their primary goal is what they call price stability, which they define as inflation being close to, but just under, 2%. They mainly use interest rate policy to achieve this, but sometimes they also step into foreign exchange markets to manage the value of their currency. For a small, open economy like Switzerland, keeping the Swiss franc from becoming too strong is, it's vital. Vital for maintaining their competitive edge and preventing further downward pressure on inflation.
I think I recall reading that they have some kind of system to protect the banks a little bit when rates do go negative.
You're right, they do. The SNB uses what's called a tiered remuneration system. This just means that only a portion of a bank's reserves is actually subject to the negative interest rate. A larger part is exempt. Recent research looking at how banks interact suggests these tiered systems actually mirror market behavior pretty well, and they help to balance the effectiveness of the negative rate policy with, the need to maintain a stable financial sector. Protects bank profitability to some extent.
This all sounds very specific to Switzerland, but how might this kind of thing connect to what, say, you or I experience in our day-to-day lives?
Oh, absolutely it connects. Changes in inflation and interest rates, they directly impact consumer behavior. Imagine you're in the supermarket, right? When inflation is low or even falling, like the worry in Switzerland, you might decide to wait on buying certain non-essential items. You might expect prices to stay the same or even drop. Conversely, if you're facing rising prices at the checkout, you're probably more likely to prioritize necessities, actively hunt for discounts, and maybe change your shopping habits altogether to stay within your budget. It's a constant give and take.
Between buying power and economic signals.
Exactly. Your buying power versus the economic signals being sent by central banks. And just on a related note, recent studies seem to suggest that assets like Bitcoin don't reliably act as a shield against inflation, which might challenge some common beliefs about cryptocurrencies as, safe investments during times of rising prices.
Interesting. It's fascinating how these big global economic currents eventually trickle down to us. Now let's tackle a problem we see almost everywhere: plastic pollution. The Malay Mail has a headline: Malaysia imposes anti-dumping duties on PET plastic imports from China, Indonesia. Okay, why the focus on these particular imports?
Well, what's significant here is the growing global recognition of plastic pollution as just this massive crisis. In 2019 alone, we produced an astounding 368 million tons of plastic, with Asia accounting for over half of that. And the sobering truth is, since the 1950s, only a tiny fraction, maybe around 9%, has actually been recycled. The rest just lingers in our environment, harming wildlife, potentially even entering our own bodies. Some projections suggest that by 2050, we could have more plastic than fish in our oceans by weight.
Wow. That's an alarming statistic.
It really is. And this action in Malaysia, it highlights this growing global awareness and the urgent need for broader, more sustainable solutions to manage the mountains of plastic waste we're generating.
And we constantly hear about the sheer volume of plastic entering the oceans each year, too.
Yeah, the estimates range wildly from maybe 1.1 million up to 8.8 million tons annually, mostly originating from coastal communities. And this plastic just wreaks havoc on marine life through entanglement, ingestion, exposure to harmful chemicals. It's estimated that up to 90% of seabirds now have plastic debris in their systems.
So Malaysia's move with these duties, it's about trying to stem the flow of even more plastic waste into the country.
Precisely. Anti-dumping duties are essentially tariffs. They're imposed on imports sold at unfairly low prices, often below their production cost. In this case, Malaysia is aiming to protect its domestic industries from being undercut by cheap PET plastic imports from China and Indonesia. However, research does indicate that these kinds of duties can sometimes lead to circumvention.
Circumvention, like finding a way around them.
Exactly, where the trade is simply rerouted through other countries to avoid the duty. People are even using sophisticated data analysis now to try and detect these evasion tactics.
It seems like technology is constantly giving us new ways to, well, understand the scale of this problem, at least.
Absolutely. Recent advancements in satellite monitoring are providing crucial insights. Researchers are using things like neural networks to analyze satellite data, specifically to map and track terrestrial plastic waste sites. In Indonesia, for example, they identified far more waste sites than were previously known publicly. And across 12 Southeast Asian countries, they found nearly 1,000 sites, with a significant percentage located dangerously close to waterways.
Which means a high risk of it ending up in the ocean.
Exactly, posing a high risk of leakage into the oceans.
So what are the bigger picture solutions being discussed, to try and turn the tide on plastic pollution?
Well, the approach really needs to be multi-pronged. It's not just one thing. It involves reducing our overall consumption of plastic, for starters, improving recycling infrastructure and rates, developing and using alternative materials, and strengthening international agreements. The 2019 amendment to the Basel Convention, which regulates the export of plastic waste, that's one step, and that's a potentially significant development. Southeast Asia, though, remains a critical region in this fight. Because of its rapid economic growth and the challenges in managing increasing waste volumes, you still have many large waste sites located near rivers and coastlines there.
It's a monumental challenge, no doubt. Okay, shifting our focus now towards corporate responsibility. This community has this headline: SILTSA ESG Conference to tackle sustainability, regulation, and risk in supply chains. ESG, that's environmental, social, and governance, right? Sounds like this is becoming a major area of focus for businesses.
It absolutely is. In 2024, we're seeing really significant regulatory trends shaping how companies manage sustainability and risk in their global supply chains. Laws like the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act or the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the U.S., they're putting pressure on companies to ensure they're conducting thorough checks, being transparent about their operations, and, crucially, eliminating forced labor throughout their supply networks. We're also seeing increased scrutiny and regulatory action, particularly in Europe, against greenwashing.
Greenwashing, like companies making misleading claims about how eco-friendly they are.
Exactly. Misleading claims about their environmental efforts. Regulators are cracking down.
So how are companies actually trying to become more transparent and meet these ESG standards? Are they using tech?
Yes. Technology is playing an increasingly important role here. We're seeing the development of collaborative digital platforms, specifically designed for supply chain transparency. These platforms can automate the process of bringing suppliers on board, making supply chain data publicly accessible, which helps with meeting ESG standards and regulatory requirements. However, it's worth noting current adoption rates are still relatively low, so there's progress, but also significant room for improvement.
Does prioritizing sustainability in their supply chains actually make good business sense for these companies? Or is it just pressure?
That's a crucial question. And despite, global disruptions we've seen, the trend seems to be that organizations are continuing to prioritize sustainability. They're recognizing its long-term importance. Data from the World Economic Forum indicates that a focus on reducing emissions throughout the supply chain, improving overall sustainability. It can actually lead to enhanced resilience, better risk management, and even provide a competitive advantage for companies that adopt these practices early on.
Logistics and transportation are obviously huge parts of supply chains. What are the main environmental hurdles in that sector specifically?
Yeah, the logistics sector is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, no question. Also, air and noise pollution. The industry is definitely exploring greener technologies and more sustainable practices to address these challenges. The global market for green technology and sustainability in this sector is projected to grow significantly in the coming years, which reflects increased investment. However, it's worth noting that a considerable percentage of businesses, maybe around 40%, still struggle to meet their ESG targets, and about 20% aren't even sure how to improve.
And AI is helping to make logistics more environmentally friendly, isn't it? I feel like I've read about that.
Yes, AI and advanced data analysis are proven to be really powerful tools here. They can optimize logistics, reduce resource consumption, lower emissions by finding more efficient routes, managing cargo better, and they can significantly speed up the process of calculating carbon footprints, cutting down the time it takes to analyze these complex scenarios from days to mere minutes. Although there is an ongoing scholarly discussion about the best ways to measure carbon emissions, some research suggests we need more sophisticated approaches to actually achieve real reductions in overall carbon output beyond just accounting tricks.
It sounds like the pressure on both businesses and governments to embrace more sustainable practices is only going to intensify then.
Exactly. Increased pressure from consumers, from investors, from regulators, it's all leading to more structured and accountable approaches to supply chain sustainability. Managers and policymakers are both playing critical roles in driving this shift toward higher ESG performance, though, challenges around transparency, measurement, and enforcement definitely remain.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to a really fundamental resource, water. The Financial Times has this headline: Consumer Watchdog calls for review of water bills in England and Wales. What's the story there?
Well, what's interesting here is this strong push for innovation within the water utility sector over England and Wales. We're seeing a significant rollout of smart water meters. Over 10 million are planned as part of their upcoming asset management plan, AMP8. There's also increasing adoption of AI for tasks like detecting leaks, tracking pollution sources, even predicting when maintenance will be needed. Plus, initiatives like the National Storm Overflow Hub are making real-time data about sewage overflows publicly accessible.
Okay, smart meters and AI. They sound like they could offer some real benefits for consumers.
Oh, they offer numerous advantages for both consumers and the environment. Smart meters give you precise data on your water usage, helping you identify leaks early, reduce waste. AI can analyze huge amounts of data to predict and prevent service disruptions, optimize water quality treatment, minimize pollution incidents. These technologies contribute to greater water efficiency, help build resilience against droughts and floods, and support broader environmental goals like reducing energy consumption and emissions linked to water treatment and distribution.
But the headline suggests consumers aren't entirely happy. What's behind this call for a review of water bills?
Yeah, the primary concern from consumer watchdogs, especially the Consumer Council for Water, stems from the pretty significant proposed increases in water and sewage bills. We're talking an average of 21%, which could be 32% once you factor in inflation over the period from 2025 to 2030. They argue these increases are unfair, particularly given the past performance and environmental records of some water companies. They point out that only a small percentage of customers actually find these proposed increases affordable. And a large proportion, maybe 40%, are already struggling with their current bills.
It's an affordability issue.
It's a major affordability issue. Now, the regulatory body of QUAT did push back. They forced a 12% reduction in the company's initial proposals. But they still maintain that some bill rises are necessary to fund essential investments in infrastructure and innovation. So, as you might see reflected in your own utility bills in the future, this balance between investing in infrastructure and ensuring affordability is becoming a really critical point of discussion.
It definitely sounds like a tricky balancing act between needing that investment and keeping costs manageable.
Exactly. The water industry in England and Wales, it was privatized back in 1989. And since then, regulatory bodies have played this crucial role in overseeing water quality and pricing. You could argue this model has driven investment in new tech like smart meters and the move towards more open data. However, this current debate really highlights the ongoing challenge, doesn't it? Balancing profitability with providing essential public services and ensuring they remain affordable for everyone.
And we're also seeing progress in predicting severe weather events like flooding, aren't we? Using tech for that too.
Yes, absolutely. There's been some really exciting progress in flood prediction. Recent research has demonstrated the effectiveness of using advanced computer programs, deep convolutional neural networks, specifically for rapid, accurate, real-time forecasting of river flooding. A study in Carlisle, UK, showed this approach can outperform traditional methods. It could potentially provide earlier warnings, enable more effective responses to protect communities, and reduce damage. That's a direct benefit to consumers living in flood-prone areas.
And these rising water bills, what kind of impact are they actually expected to have on household budgets?
Well, economic analysis and consumer surveys suggest that a significant portion of households, maybe around 40% across England and Wales, anticipate struggling to afford these higher water bills. This has led the Consumer Council for Water to advocate for something called a universal social tariff. The idea is it would replace the current patchwork of support schemes and aim to provide more consistent, reliable assistance for vulnerable customers facing water poverty. The adoption of these new water technologies, it often follows how new ideas spread. It depends on how consumers see the benefits.
Like cost savings, environmental protection.
Exactly. Cost savings, environmental protection, reliability.
Right.
People see those advantages, they're more likely to adopt. And government support and transparency can really help accelerate that process.
Okay, let's move on to what we eat. Food Navigator Asia has this headline: FSSAI proposes stricter rules for dairy analogues to protect consumer transparency. Dairy analogues, we're talking things like almond milk, vegan cheese, that kind of stuff, right? Why the need for stricter rules in India specifically?
You've got it. Dairy analogues are those plant-based products designed to resemble traditional dairy in taste, texture, how we use them. The Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, or FSSAI, is proposing stricter regulations primarily to address concerns about potential confusion among consumers and misleading labeling. They basically want to ensure that shoppers aren't being misled about the actual ingredients and, importantly, the nutritional value of these products compared to traditional dairy. The aim is just greater clarity.
So how might these new rules actually change how these products are labeled and sold over there?
Well, the proposed rules would likely limit the use of dairy-related terms like milk or cheese on plant-based alternatives, unless, that is, they meet very specific standards, which would probably be quite difficult for non-dairy products to achieve. There's also likely to be more careful oversight of the licensing of vegan and other plant-based products, just to ensure manufacturers are following these new labeling standards and not making claims that could potentially mislead consumers.
What's the general feeling among consumers about these vegan and plant-based dairy alternatives, both in India and, more globally?
Well, current trends indicate a growing positive perception, especially online and on social media platforms. However, there's still definitely some skepticism among those who don't follow a vegan diet. Research suggests the vegan community tends to be predominantly female, interestingly, and the marketing of these plant-based alternatives often emphasizes their benefits for health and, of course, the environment. Globally, we're certainly seeing a move towards more plant-based eating, although, traditional food preferences can still play a pretty significant role in how quickly people adopt these alternatives.
And from an environmental standpoint, are these dairy alternatives generally seen as a better choice?
Generally, yes. Plant-based dairy alternatives tend to have a smaller environmental footprint compared to traditional dairy production. They typically require less water, produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions, and use significantly less land. So this aligns with broader efforts towards sustainability and can help reduce the overall environmental impact of our food system.
It's interesting how technology is even helping to improve these plant-based products themselves.
Absolutely. Innovation in recipe development, particularly using AI and machine learning, is helping create plant-based alternatives designed to meet specific dietary needs, like veganism or lactose intolerance. These technologies can assist in developing products that more closely mimic the taste and texture of traditional dairy. And that can be a really key factor in wider consumer acceptance, right? Taste and texture are huge.
Definitely. What are the potential economic consequences for, say, farmers and food manufacturers if more people in India do choose these vegan options?
Well, the increasing popularity of vegan dairy alternatives could create both challenges and opportunities, really. Traditional dairy farmers might potentially see a decrease in demand for their products. However, this could also create new market opportunities for farmers who grow the raw materials needed for plant-based alternatives, soy, oats, almonds, etc. And for manufacturers, investing in the plant-based sector could certainly lead to growth and job creation in new areas of the food industry.
Despite the growing interest, are there still obstacles to overcome for these products to become, more mainstream?
Oh, yes. Research suggests several barriers still exist. These include ongoing skepticism among some consumers about the actual health benefits of vegan diets, strong cultural preferences for traditional dairy products, especially in places like India, and sometimes just a general lack of awareness about the variety and quality of plant-based alternatives that are now available. Overcoming these hurdles will likely require more consumer education, clearer and more transparent labeling like FSSAI is proposing, and continued improvements in the taste and texture of the products themselves to better meet consumer expectations.
Now let's talk about a really critical issue: feeding those in need around the world. NPR has a pretty stark headline: "Feeding the hungry will be harder than ever for the world's largest food aid agency." This sounds deeply concerning.
It is indeed. The World Food Program, the WFP, is facing unprecedented budget cuts right now, and this is forcing them to make incredibly difficult decisions. Things like reducing food rations, suspending vital programs entirely, and prioritizing aid to only the most critical areas, leaving others out. The likely result of this is, unfortunately, a worsening of nutrition deficiencies, especially among children and pregnant women, who are always the most vulnerable to malnutrition.
So these budget cuts directly mean that more people, real people, will go without enough nutritious food.
Exactly. The WFP's reduced ability to distribute nutritious food means millions will have insufficient dietary intake. That leads directly to a higher risk of stunted growth, wasting, other severe forms of malnutrition. Countries already struggling with food insecurity, think places like Burkina Faso, which rely heavily on food aid due to conflict, climate disasters. They are particularly at risk of seeing a sharp increase in these nutrition deficiency rates.
It feels like these global food and nutrition challenges are just incredibly complex and interconnected.
They absolutely are. And recent research really highlights the importance of taking a comprehensive, almost systems-level approach to tackling these issues. This involves bringing together knowledge and perspectives from many different fields: agriculture, health, economics, environment. By understanding the relationships between all these factors, we can hopefully develop more effective and sustainable ways to combat both hunger and malnutrition.
On a more personal level, perhaps for those of us eating plant-based diets, are there specific nutritional considerations we should keep in mind based on recent findings?
Yes, definitely. Analysis of nutrient content has identified some key dietary recommendations for those on plant-based diets. For example, young lima beans turn out to be a good source of essential amino acids, the building blocks for protein, and also choline, which is important for brain health. Mushrooms can provide vitamin D, which can be harder to get from plants. However, research also indicates that plant-based diets may sometimes be lacking in certain minerals, like selenium. So careful planning of meals is really important to ensure you're getting everything your body needs. It's not automatic.
The WFT has such an enormous reach, normally, doesn't it?
It really does. In 2023, they reached over 152 million people across more than 120 countries, providing emergency food relief, technical assistance, support for building long-term resilience. It's vast. But with the current funding shortfalls, the populations they serve, particularly children, pregnant women, those in conflict and disaster zones, they face a significantly increased risk of nutrition deficiency due to interruptions in this vital food assistance.
And the health consequences go beyond just hunger, right?
Oh, absolutely. The health consequences can be devastating and long-lasting. We're talking stunted growth, increased susceptibility to infections, impaired brain development, even higher rates of maternal mortality. It's also important for aid organizations now to consider not just a lack of food, undernutrition, but also the growing problem of unhealthy diets and overnutrition in some areas. The focus needs to be on promoting overall nutritional adequacy, not just providing calories.
Okay, let's switch to something that many families deal with daily: kids' snacks. Consumer Reports has this piece: 5 things to know about kids' snack bars. What are the main takeaways for parents trying to navigate that aisle?
Yeah, this is really useful stuff for parents trying to make healthier choices. First off, it's helpful to know the USDA actually has guidelines for snacks served in schools. These guidelines, under the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, aim to limit things like added sugar, calories, unhealthy fats, while encouraging whole grains. So as a guideline for shopping, look for snack bars with less than 10 grams of sugar, under 180 calories, a moderate amount of fat, say around 5 grams or less, and ideally with whole grains listed as the first ingredient or meeting specific nutrient standards.
So what are some of the beneficial ingredients parents should maybe look for? The article mentions whole grain oats, for instance.
Yes, whole grain oats are a fantastic nutritional choice for kids. They're packed with soluble fiber, especially a type called beta-glucan, which is known to be good for heart health. For children, oats help them feel full for longer. They support healthy digestion. And there's even some research suggesting a link between eating oats and a lower risk of developing asthma. Plus, they're generally gluten-free and don't often cause allergies, which is a bonus.
And on the flip side, What are the things parents should really try to avoid in these snack bars? Added sugar is probably the big one, I imagine.
Absolutely. Regularly eating too much added sugar can have significant negative effects on children's health. It increases their risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, dental problems, even cardiovascular disease down the line. Experts really recommend limiting added sugar intake as much as possible. So when choosing snack bars, looking for options with less than 5 grams of added sugar per serving is definitely a better choice.
Are there any signs that these efforts to promote healthier eating among kids are actually having a positive impact? Is it working?
Encouragingly, yes. A recent study looked at a nutrition education program in Texas, EFNEP. It found significant improvements in children's overall diet quality, particularly in how much fruit and whole grains they were eating. Similar positive effects have been seen in other federal programs aimed at improving children's nutrition. So it does suggest that these initiatives are indeed helping to encourage healthier eating habits, which is great news.
So, boiling it down, what are the top recommendations for parents when they're actually in the store picking out snack bars for their kids?
Okay, the key is really to become a bit of a label detective. Aim for bars with less than 10 grams of sugar, under 180 calories. That's a good starting point. Pay attention to the type of fat, trying to minimize saturated fat. Check that a whole grain, like oats, is listed as the main first ingredient. Choose bars with ingredients you actually recognize, and generally fewer ingredients overall. And try to avoid those with lots of highly processed additives.
So simpler is generally better.
Generally, yes. Studies have shown that snack bars made with more whole foods tend to have better nutritional profiles. They're usually healthier for kids because they have less added sugars, unhealthy fats, and sodium. And interestingly, advancements in technology for tracking nutrition like these detailed digital 3D models of food are actually helping provide more accurate information on what kids are eating, which in turn can help guide healthier choices based on better data.
Fascinating. Okay, finally, let's talk about a kitchen staple. Cooking oil. Verywell Health on MSN.com has an article, 4 healthiest cooking oils you should use and 4 you should avoid. What are the good ones they recommend?
Right. The article highlights avocado oil, olive oil, safflower oil, and sesame oil as beneficial choices for cooking. The common thread is they're rich in unsaturated fats, both monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. They're also packed with antioxidants and other beneficial plant compounds, polyphenols. These components are known to contribute to heart health and can help reduce inflammation in the body. Olive oil, of course, is a cornerstone of the Mediterranean diet, famous for its health benefits. Avocado, safflower, and sesame oils also offer those healthy fats and generally have higher smoke points, making them pretty versatile for different cooking methods.
And which oils should we be more careful about using or maybe avoid altogether?
The ones to limit or avoid are those high in saturated and trans fats. This typically includes coconut oil, palm oil, and anything listed as partially hydrogenated oil. Trans fats, often found in those partially hydrogenated oils, have been strongly linked to negative outcomes for both heart and brain health. Health organizations pretty much say avoid them entirely. Palm oil raises some concerns due to its high saturated fat content, particularly for people already at risk of heart disease or diabetes.
Smoke point is something we often hear mentioned with cooking oils. Why exactly is that important?
Yeah, the smoke point is basically the temperature at which an oil starts to break down and smoke. When it does that, it can produce potentially harmful compounds. Oils with higher smoke points, like avocado or safflower, are more stable at high heat. That makes them safer for cooking methods like frying or stir-frying. Research has actually shown that heating oils with lower smoke points to high temperatures, like, say, extra virgin olive oil, can release higher levels of tiny particles, PM2.5 and PM10, which can be harmful if inhaled. So choosing an oil with an appropriate smoke point for how you're cooking is pretty crucial, both for safety and for maintaining the oil's nutritional quality.
And it's not just about the smoke point, but also the type of fat in the oil itself, right? The composition.
Precisely. The fatty acid composition, that balance of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fats, has a direct impact on how a cooking oil affects our health. The monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats found in olive, avocado, safflower, and sesame oils are generally considered beneficial for cardiovascular health. Conversely, oils high in saturated fats can raise levels of LDL, the bad cholesterol, and increase heart disease risk. So general dietary advice really emphasizes choosing oils rich in unsaturated fats and limiting saturated and trans fats for optimal health. It's interesting. Recent studies have even looked at the potential for air pollution inside the home when heating different cooking oils, noting that various oils release different amounts of those tiny particles at high temperatures.
So even the type of oil impacts indoor air quality while cooking.
It seems so, yeah. And current recommendations also often suggest opting for oils that are less processed, like unrefined or cold-pressed oils, whenever possible. They tend to retain more of their beneficial nutrients. And these recommendations can also be tailored, to specific age groups and health needs, but the core message is consistent. Encourage unsaturated fats for everyone. Avoid saturated and trans fats across the board.
Wow, okay. We have really covered a lot of ground today, from the intricacies of global trade and central bank policies, all the way to the pressing issue of plastic pollution, the changing landscape of our food systems, and even the best choices for cooking oils right in our own kitchens. It's actually amazing to see how interconnected all these seemingly different topics really are, and how they all ultimately affect us as consumers, in our daily lives. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me today.
My pleasure. It's been a truly insightful exploration, hasn't it?
It really has. And thank you, for joining us on this deep dive. Considering all the fascinating information we've unpacked today, here's a thought. What single global trend do you think will have the most surprising or maybe the most significant impact in the next 5 years? It's definitely something to think about. Until our next deep dive.